Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Jack Hagel. It's January, but the November elections still aren't resolved in North Carolina. The race for a seat on the state Supreme Court is still up in the air, even though the incumbent received more votes. It's tied up because of a challenge over voter eligibility, and now it's playing out in court. WRAL State Government reporter Will Doran has been tracking the case, and he joins us now to break it all down. Will, good to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
When all the votes were counted in this Supreme Court race and then recounted, incumbent Justice Allison Riggs appeared to have kept her seat. Where's the count now?
Yes, she does appear to have held on by a very slim margin. There were well over 5 million people voted, and she is leading by only 734 votes.
But the state hasn't certified the election. Why not?
Well, the Supreme Court won't let them. Riggs's Republican opponent, Jefferson Griffin, is attempting to throw out the ballots of 60,000 voters who voted in this year's elections. And while he is pursuing that challenge in the courts, the state Supreme Court has stepped in and said, State Board of Elections, you cannot certify this race. We need to basically give Griffin time to make these arguments.
Now, why does he argue that these 60,000 votes shouldn't count?
It's essentially an argument that the state can't prove that all of these voters are who they say they are. Now, a lot of these people have come out and said, hi, I'm me. I'm not an imposter. In fact, two of the voters he's challenging are Allison Riggs' own parents. But regardless, these legal challenges are going to continue. They're in court now. And even despite a lot of the folks who have been challenged affirming their identities, so far, that hasn't made a difference.
Now, the reason this is in court is because Griffin is challenging what the State Board of Elections has said about this. He brought this to the State Board first, and what was their position, and where do they stand now on this?
Exactly. This didn't start in court. Like with any election thing, it starts with the State Board of Elections. And so he laid his case out to the 5 members on the State Board of Elections, and they shot him down. And it was in a series of different votes. Most of them were entirely along party lines. Democrats control 3 of the seats on the board. Republicans have the other 2 seats. And on just about everything, it was a 3-2 vote to shoot down Griffin's complaints. But what the board said was essentially all of these people are eligible to vote. And even more importantly, we told them they were eligible to vote and allowed them to cast a ballot. And it is going to just crater public trust in elections if you let someone vote and then, in their view, change the rules after the fact and punish people for not following those rules that didn't exist at the time.
Well, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll hear more about the arguments in this case and why state and federal courts are involved. Stick around. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. We're talking with WRAL State Government reporter Will Doran about the fight over a seat on the North Carolina Supreme Court. Will, the state Supreme Court is already controlled by Republicans who tend to already rule in favor of Republican interests. Would this seat really matter in the grand scheme of things?
It would, because right now we've got a 5-2 court, and if Riggs hangs on, it will stay a 5-2 court, and if Griffin wins, it will become a 6-1 court. So it'll become, even more Republican leaning than it currently is, and that not only makes a difference immediately. Say there's some issue that comes up that the Republicans aren't unanimous on, but also looking ahead to Democrats' chance to take back control of the court. The seats that they have, they're all 8-year-long terms that these justices have, but they're staggered. So basically every election, you've got at least 1 and sometimes 2 or 3 seats up for grabs each year. And so Democrats could potentially flip back control of the court in the 2028 elections because there's 3 seats up that year. All 3 of those seats are held by Republicans. So if Democrats can win all 3 of those seats, then they have a very good chance of winning back control of the court. But that's only going to be possible if they defend at least 1 of the 2 seats that they currently have. One of those, obviously, is Justice Riggs' seat here. The other one is going to be Anita Earls, who's up for re-election in 2026. So, if Griffin wins here this year, that makes it a lot harder potentially for Democrats to flip back control of the court, and would be impossible, at least as quickly as 2028, if Republicans also were able to unseat Anita Earls in 2026.
And regaining control isn't out of the realm of reality. After all, Democrats make up the second biggest voting bloc behind unaffiliated voters, right?
Yeah, and Democrats had control of the court until the 2022 elections. Republicans won every single judicial election in statewide races in both 2020 and in 2022, and that allowed them to sweep to power ahead of this year in the 2024 elections. But, what swings for one party can always swing for another party. And, the Democrats had control of the court for close to a decade until, that 2022 result.
And the partisan makeup obviously is important because the court has been overseeing a number of political cases, right?
Yes. Obviously the judges and justices themselves will tell you that politics don't factor into their decisions. But when you just look at the breakdown of votes, especially on cases that explicitly deal with politics, whether that's about gerrymandering or voter ID or, arguments between a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature, it almost always breaks down entirely along political lines. That's not always the case in business cases or in criminal appeals, but especially on these big political cases that the Supreme Court has increasingly been hearing here in North Carolina, it does almost always break down along partisan lines.
Now, in addition to Griffin's battle over the votes, there's also this disagreement over which court should hear this case, right?
Exactly, and it has just really ping-ponged back and forth. But you're right, Griffin wants this to be heard in state court because, like we were talking about, Republicans control the state Supreme Court. And Democrats want to be heard in federal court, potentially because Republicans control the state Supreme Court, but also because they say that this is really just a matter for federal judges to decide, in part because federal judges have already looked at these arguments. The Republican Party brought these exact same legal arguments during the 2024 election, seeking to block these voters from being allowed to vote at all. It went up to federal court, and that argument got shot down. Both a federal trial court judge and the Federal Court of Appeals said, no, not going to work. We're going to allow these people to vote. So the Democrats and the State Board of Elections are basically pointing to those court decisions from October. This is not ancient history. These are from October. It's like, hey, remember when you ruled that all these people were allowed to vote? Can we have some clarity that they were indeed allowed to vote? And so Griffin has filed in state court, then it went up to federal court, then it got kicked back down to state court, then it went back up to federal court, and as of right now, I was just looking at my phone earlier to check, there have been no decisions from the Federal Court of Appeals on who exactly is going to take this over, but that's whose court the ball is in right now.
And I should probably note that this is being recorded on Friday, January 10th, and so for the latest on this case, make sure you go to WRAL.com for the most up-to-date information. Now, Will, is it a conflict of interest for the state Supreme Court to hear a case involving its own members?
Not technically. Some people say that it is, but the court can essentially do whatever it wants. I will say that Justice Riggs herself has recused from any discussions of this matter. She still remains on the court while all of this is pending, but she has recused herself from this case specifically. So it's going to be only 6 justices hearing this case. But the court has given itself broad power to be able to basically hear whatever cases it wants. In fact, in just a couple of years ago, it issued an order saying that no individual justice can be forced to recuse from something, essentially no matter how strong any evidence is for recusal, if they don't want to recuse themselves. And so if the court wants to hear the case, it can hear the case.
Now, I would imagine that these voters who are being challenged aren't really happy about that, if they even know that their vote is being challenged. On that point, how can people find out if they're among those being challenged? And is there anything they can do, should do? What do you tell them?
Yeah, we've heard from a lot of these voters, and you are right, they are not happy that they are essentially being accused of, committing voter fraud or being potential imposters. This is all public record, so you can go online, and we've got links in our article to the State Board of Elections website and find all of the files where it lists the voters who are being challenged and also the specific reason why they're being challenged, because there's about 3 or 4 different reasons why some voters are being challenged. And then also, there are some other people who have made it a little bit easier to search than the State Board of Elections have. And, they have their own spreadsheets and databases out there. And, a lot of those are floating around on social media. I'm sure people have probably seen those as well. But yeah, if you find this list, look for your name, look for your friends or your family's names. And then what you can do is just call your county elections board and say, hey, my name was on that list of voters that Jefferson Griffin is challenging. I'm not really sure why. I understand maybe you need my driver's license number or the last four of my social security number. Here they are. And what that will allow the county officials to do is to actually update that spreadsheet, make sure that it does indeed match with what it should match. And then you can at least be assured that, you should be allowed to vote in future elections. Whether or not it'll protect your vote from being thrown out this year is still up in the air. That's ultimately going to come down to the judges hearing this case, but that should at least protect you in the future.
How did Griffin decide that it was 60,000 voters and these ones in particular?
So he has three main legal arguments, and about 99% of these 60,000 fall into one of them, which is people who this state database is supposed to have either their social security number or their driver's license, and it doesn't. And that can be for any number of reasons. One, it hasn't always been mandatory that the state collect that data. It only became mandatory in the early 2000s. Two, maybe some government worker along the line screwed up and entered your number wrong or accidentally clicked delete on the Excel cell or, whatever, just did it wrong. But three, and this seems to maybe be the most common reason, is, people change their names. And, maybe they've gotten married, maybe they've gotten divorced, or maybe they, sometimes spell their hyphenated last name with a hyphen. Sometimes they spell their last name, which is two names, without a hyphen. And that might cause it to not match either, just like these little kind of clerical errors. And so that is about that is 60,000 voters. And then there are also about 1,000, maybe 1,500 people who live overseas and who Griffin is also challenging, saying basically that there are certain state laws that said, overseas voters did not have to show voter ID when they voted, for one example. And Griffin is saying, yeah, that's the law, but I don't think it should have been the law, and so that should be ruled unconstitutional, and these ballots should retroactively be thrown out. So it seems that those overseas challenges are maybe a little bit more of a long shot. There's a little bit more room for interpretation on the people with the missing data. And the missing data is, like I said, about 99% of these challenges. So it's still a lot for the courts to decide there.
Do you have any sense of how many of these people are Republicans or Democrats?
They lean a little bit disproportionately Democrat. It includes unaffiliated voters, Republican voters, Democratic voters, but there have been some analyses of the voters who were picked or were listed, and it does lean a little bit more Democrat, and that's because Griffin in his challenge did not challenge anyone who voted on Election Day. He only challenged people who voted either during early voting or by mail. And it's just kind of a common fact here in North Carolina that your Election Day electorate leans Republican and your early voting and voting by mail electorate leans Democrat.
So what happens next? And do you have any sense of when this might be resolved?
No. Everyone wants it to be resolved very quickly. And I think the courts are usually pretty slow. But I think in a case like this, everyone recognizes that, hey, we are talking about a seat on the most important court in the state. This is a huge deal. We need to know who's the actual, real, legitimate Supreme Court justice. And so the Supreme Court's first oral arguments are in mid-February, and I think there's really a lot of pressure from basically everyone to get this figured out before then.
Going to be interesting to see where this one lands. Thanks, Will.
Thank you.
That's WRAL State Government reporter Will Doran for his breakdown of the battle over the state Supreme Court seat. Go to the NC Capitol section of WRAL.com. I'm Jack Hagel. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download and for making us part of your morning routine. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.